The day I walked back into my hometown, my cousin looked me up and down, laughed, and said, "So the city finally spit you out." She said it loud enough for everyone at the welcome table to hear. And I smiled. Because what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the pen sitting in my bag could erase everything they had built. Everything. Let me take you back. Not to the beginning of the pain. No. Let me take you to the moment the pain became something else entirely. I was 35 years old. I had just driven 4 hours in a car with a dent on the passenger door and a cracked dashboard. I was wearing a cotton blouse I bought from a clearance rack 3 years ago, and my shoes had a small scuff on the left toe that I'd never bothered to fix. I looked like someone who had lost. That was the point. But before I tell you what happened when I walked back into that town, before I tell you about the gala, the revelation, the look on their faces, I need to tell you who I was before I left. Because if you don't understand who I was, you won't understand what I became. And more importantly, you won't understand why I chose to walk back into that room at all. My name is Diane Mercer, and I grew up in Calloway Creek, a small, suffocating town in rural Georgia, where everybody knew your name, your business, your failures, and your family history going back 3 generations. My family, the Mercers, were the closest thing Calloway Creek had to royalty. My uncle, Gerald Mercer, owned the most profitable real estate brokerage in the county. My aunt, Patricia, sat on the board of the local hospital and the town council. My cousins, 3 of them, had married into money, started businesses, and positioned themselves as the spine of everything that happened in that town. They were powerful, and they made sure you knew it. I was the outlier. My mother was Gerald's sister, the one who had married a schoolteacher instead of a businessman, the one who had lived modestly, loved quietly, and died too young. Breast cancer. I was 19, and when she passed, whatever thin thread connected me to the Mercer family's warmth, if there ever was warmth, went with her. After that, I was tolerated, included in family dinners like a courtesy, spoken to in that particular tone people use when they feel sorry for you but don't want to show it too obviously. I tried not to let it hurt. I built a life for myself in Calloway Creek. I worked at the county clerk's office. I took night classes at the community college. I saved every dollar I could. I was quiet. I was determined. I was trying. But the Mercers didn't see trying. They saw small. And then came the summer that changed everything. I was 27. My uncle Gerald had just purchased a beautiful piece of land on the outskirts of town. 10 acres that he planned to develop into a high-end residential community. It was his biggest project yet. He threw a party to celebrate. At that party, after 2 glasses of wine, he pulled me aside. Not to congratulate me on anything. Not to ask how I was doing. He pulled me aside to offer me a job, filing paperwork, answering phones, being his office assistant. I told him I already had a job. He laughed. "Diane," he said, "you work at the county clerk's office. You're sorting mail and notarizing documents for $12 an hour. You're wasting your potential sitting in that office." I told him I was taking classes, that I had a plan. He looked at me the way people look at children who say they want to be astronauts. Fond, slightly amused, not remotely serious. "What kind of plan?" he asked. I told him I wanted to go into finance, that I'd been studying investment principles, market behavior, asset management, that I believed I had a real aptitude for it. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something I have never forgotten. He said, "Diane, I say this with love. Some people are built for big things, and some people, through no fault of their own, are built for steady, simple things. There's no shame in that. Know which one you are. It saves you from a lot of heartbreak." I stood there, quiet, glass of wine in my hand, and I felt something shift inside me. Not break. Shift. Because in that moment, I made a decision. I was going to find out which one I was, and I was going to find out on my own terms. 6 months later, I left Calloway Creek. I left Calloway. I had saved $11,000. I had 1 suitcase. I had a contact in Atlanta, a woman I'd met through an online finance forum who had agreed to let me rent her spare room for $400 a month. When I told my Aunt Patricia I was leaving for Atlanta, she smiled that thin smile of hers and said, "Well, Let's hope the city is kinder to you than it is to most. When I told my cousin Regina, the eldest, the one who had always been the cruelest in the most elegant way, she said nothing at first, just looked me over, then said, "Diane, you don't have connections in Atlanta, you don't have a degree, you don't have family money. What exactly is your plan?" I said, "I'll figure it out." She nodded slowly, like that confirmed everything she'd already believed. I got in my car and I drove away from Calloway Creek, and I did not look back. Let me tell you something about starting from nothing in a city that doesn't care about your name. It is terrifying, and it is the most clarifying thing that will ever happen to you. In Atlanta, no one knew I was a Mercer. No one knew my uncle owned land. No one cared who my aunt sat on the board with. I was just Diane, a woman in a rented room with $11,000 and a hunger that I could not fully explain to anyone. The first year was brutal. I worked 2 jobs, data entry during the day, bookkeeping at night for a small restaurant chain. I studied every evening, not for a class, for myself. I was reading everything I could about finance, about private equity, about distressed asset acquisition, terms I barely understood at first, frameworks that seemed impossibly complex. I made mistakes. I misread market signals. I put $2,000 into a position that lost 60% in a week. I sat in my small room and stared at the number on my screen and felt the specific, hollow fear of someone who has no safety net. I called no one, because there was no one to call who would not say, "Come home, Diane. It was a nice try." So I absorbed the loss. I analyzed what I'd done wrong. I adjusted, and I kept going. The second year, I got a job at a small private equity firm, a boutique operation with 6 employees. I was the most junior person there. I made coffee. I prepared presentation decks. I sat in meetings and said nothing and listened to everything. My boss, a sharp, impatient woman named Sandra Holt, told me in my 3rd month that she'd hired me because she saw something in my application that she couldn't quite name. "You write about money like you've been wronged by it," she said. "That's either going to make you very good at this or very dangerous." I wasn't sure which one to be yet. Sandra became, without ever meaning to, the most important mentor of my life. She was not warm, she was not encouraging in the conventional sense, but she was honest in a way that no one in my family had ever been honest with me. She showed me where I was wrong and why. She pushed me into situations I wasn't ready for, and watched to see if I'd swim. I swam. Not perfectly. Not without swallowing water. But I swam. By year 3, I was doing actual deal analysis. By year 4, I was leading due diligence on small acquisitions. By year 5, I had built a reputation in a very specific niche, distressed regional assets. Properties, businesses, and financial portfolios in smaller markets that had been over-leveraged, mismanaged, or hit by local economic shifts. In plain terms, I had become very good at finding things that looked worthless and discovering what they were actually worth. And then one day, the thing I found was something I had not been looking for at all. It started with a client. A private investment group out of Nashville had asked our firm to evaluate a portfolio of Southern regional lending institutions, small finance companies and credit operations that specialized in rural property financing. It was unglamorous work, the kind of deal that larger firms passed on because the numbers weren't impressive enough. But I had learned, from Sandra, from years of quiet observation, that unglamorous deals in small markets were where the real leverage lived. I spent 3 months deep in that portfolio. Documents, loan books, borrower profiles, default rates, property liens. And somewhere in the 3rd month, deep in a spreadsheet that had been exported from a company called Creston Capital Partners, I saw a name, Mercer Real Estate Holdings, LLC. I stopped. I sat very still for a long moment, then I scrolled and kept scrolling. Mercer Real Estate Holdings had taken out 4 separate commercial loans through Creston Capital over the past 7 years. The total outstanding balance, including interest and a restructured payment agreement from 18 months ago, was approximately $2.3 million. I pulled the property schedules attached to those loans, every major piece of land my Uncle Gerald owned, the 10-acre development, the commercial strip on Calloway Main Street, the office building where Mercer Realty had its headquarters, 3 residential investment properties. All of it was collateral. All of it was leveraged. All of it was held together by a financing arrangement with Creston Capital Partners, a company that was currently being offered for acquisition as part of the portfolio I was evaluating. I sat back in my chair. My hands were completely still. My face was calm. But inside, something was happening that I cannot fully describe. It wasn't joy. It wasn't anger. It was something deeper and quieter than both. It was clarity. I picked up my phone and called Sandra. "I need to talk to you about the Creston portfolio," I said. "What about it?" "I think there's more value in it than we estimated, and I think I want to make a personal move on part of it." There was a pause. "Personal money?" she asked. "Yes." Another pause. "How much do you have?" I told her. She was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then she said, "Diane, when did you save that kind of money?" I said, "I've been focused." She laughed, just once, short and dry. "Send me what you're looking at. We'll talk tomorrow." Let me be honest with you about something. What I'm about to tell you. The move I made, it wasn't clean, it wasn't simple, and it wasn't without risk. There were nights, in the months that followed, where I lay awake and asked myself a question I had no good answer to. Was I doing this because it was a good investment? Or was I doing this because of what my uncle said to me at that party 8 years ago? Because of the way my cousin Regina looked me over? Because of every small dismissal, every tolerant smile, every moment I was made to feel like I was built for small things? I didn't have a clean answer. And I still don't. What I knew was this. The acquisition was financially sound. Creston Capital had a solid loan book, and the distressed price the Nashville group was selling it for made the numbers work. Sandra reviewed everything and agreed. But I also knew that among the loans in that book was every piece of leverage my uncle's family had ever built. And I bought it anyway. It took everything I had saved over 8 years, plus a co-investment structure Sandra helped me arrange, plus 18 months of careful, quiet legal structuring. When it was done, when Creston Capital Partners was formally acquired and restructured under a new holding entity that I controlled, I owned the debt. Not my uncle's land, not his business, his debt, which in finance is a very specific kind of power, because the person who owns your debt doesn't just own a number on a page, they own your timeline, your options, your ability to act. Every decision my uncle made, every expansion, every new project, every refinancing, would now require the approval of a lender who had a very long memory. I sat with that for a long time, and then I decided to go home. I didn't call ahead. I drove back to Calloway Creek on a Thursday in September. I wore a plain white blouse and khaki pants. I drove the old Honda with the dented door. I looked like someone who hadn't made it. I needed them to believe that, at least for a little while. The first person I ran into was my cousin Derek at the gas station on the edge of town. He was coming out with a coffee as I was pulling up. He squinted at me for a second, then recognition crossed his face. "Diane?" He looked at my car. "You back?" "Just visiting," I said. He nodded, scanning me in that quick, practiced way the Mercers did. Always assessing, always calculating where you ranked. Whatever he saw seemed to satisfy some internal conclusion, because he relaxed into a certain kind of easy condescension. "It's good you're back. Mom's been saying she hoped you'd come around eventually." A pause. "City didn't work out?" "I'm doing fine," I said. He smiled, not unkindly, almost like he felt sorry for me. "Right. Well, we're having a thing this weekend, the annual gala for the Calloway Foundation. You should come. It'll be good to have you back in the fold." He gave me directions to the venue, as if I'd forgotten where everything was. I thanked him. I watched him drive away in his $70,000 truck, and I thought, 4 days. The family dinner happened Friday night. I had not planned to go, but my Aunt Patricia called the number she apparently still had for me, and she was warm in that particular way she had when she wanted something. Not for herself, but for the appearance of things. The family being together. The image of unity. "You must come," she said. "The whole family's here. We've missed you, Diane." I went. Sitting at that table was one of the hardest things I have ever done. Not because of the cruelty. Actually, the cruelty would have been easier. What was hard was the smallness of it, the dinner table conversation about property values and town politics, and who was investing where. The way my Uncle Gerald held court at the head of the table with the absolute certainty of a man who had never doubted his own importance. He barely acknowledged me when I walked in, just a brief nod. "Diane, you look well." He said it the way you say it to someone who does not look well. My cousin Regina, 38, immaculate, wearing what I recognized as a designer blouse, came over and hugged me, and it was the kind of hug that was really an inspection. "How long are you staying?" she asked. "Just the weekend." She glanced at my blouse. "It's good you came back. Really." Her eyes said, "I knew the city would be too much for you." I sat through dinner. I ate. I listened. I smiled at the right moments and said very little. I answered questions about Atlanta with vague, modest answers that let them fill in their own conclusions. "Did you ever get into finance like you were planning?" my Uncle Gerald asked at one point. Casual, like he was asking about a childhood hobby. "I did some work in that area," I said. It's a tough industry. Very competitive." He topped off his wine. "But it sounds like you landed okay. Stability is underrated." He thought I had a normal job somewhere. Nothing impressive. He was being generous in the way powerful people are generous when they're certain you're not a threat. I nodded. "Yes," I said. "Stability matters." Later, as I was leaving, my cousin Regina caught me at the door. "The gala tomorrow," she said. "You're coming?" Derek mentioned it. "You should know," she said quietly, and her voice shifted into something more pointed. "We're announcing Dad's new development project, a big expansion. It's going to be a significant moment for the family." She looked at me. "It would be nice to have everyone there." Translation: "Come, see our success, understand how far ahead we are." "I'll be there," I said. And I meant it more than she knew. That night, alone in the small motel room I'd rented on the edge of town, I opened my laptop. I pulled up the loan documentation for Mercer Real Estate Holdings. I read through it again. All of it. The covenant clauses, the material disclosure requirements, the acceleration provisions. And I found the one I had flagged 8 months ago when I first went through this file. My uncle's new development, the one Regina had just told me about, the one they were announcing at the gala, required a draw on the existing credit facility. A significant draw. One that, under the restructured terms, required written approval from the lender. From me. He had filed the request 4 months ago, through the proper channels, through the new management at what used to be Creston Capital. It had been quietly sitting in a queue, awaiting authorization. I had not yet signed it. I closed the laptop. And for a long time, I sat in the dark of that motel room and thought about something that had nothing to do with money. I thought about my mother, about the way she used to talk about family. Not the Mercers specifically, but family as a concept, as something worth protecting. She had loved her brother Gerald despite everything. She had made excuses for him. She had taught me to be the bigger person, the quieter person, the person who let things go. I asked myself what she would want me to do tomorrow, and I sat with the fact that I didn't know. Because here is the thing about being wronged quietly over a long time. The wound doesn't look dramatic. Nobody saw what they did to me. Nobody witnessed the 1,000 small moments of dismissal. I had no proof of anything. I had only the memory of a girl who was told she was built for small things, and the woman she became in spite of that. Was tomorrow about justice? Or was it about something darker that I was dressing up as justice? I didn't sleep much that night. The gala was held at the Calloway Grand, the biggest event venue in town, a renovated old mill that my uncle had actually helped finance years ago. Of course. I arrived in my dented Honda, parked between a Mercedes and a Land Rover. Walked in wearing a simple navy dress, nothing remarkable, and carried a small clutch bag. Inside the bag, my phone, my lipstick, and a single document. The venue was beautiful. Chandeliers, round tables draped in white, a small live band, 200 of Calloway Creek's most prominent residents, business owners, elected officials, old money families, newer money families, and the Mercers at the center of all of it. My Uncle Gerald was already working the room when I arrived. He moved through the crowd the way he always had, slow, deliberate, paternal. He laughed loudly and shook hands firmly and touched shoulders with the ease of a man who believed the room belonged to him. Regina was near the entrance. She saw me and gave a small nod, not unfriendly but measuring. "Glad you came," she said. "I wouldn't have missed it," I said. There was a moment, just a moment, where I almost changed my mind. Looking at her, I thought, this is my family, flawed and cruel in their particular way, but still. I grew up with these people. I ate at their tables, I went to their weddings, and then I remembered my uncle's face at that party. Fond, amused, not remotely serious. Know which one you are. I found a seat near the back of the room. The program began at 8. There were remarks from the mayor, a short video about the Calloway Foundation's charitable work over the past year, a donation presentation from the local hospital board, my Aunt Patricia beaming in the front row. And then Gerald Mercer took the stage. He was commanding at a podium. He always had been. He spoke in that measured, resonant baritone that made people feel like they were hearing wisdom. He talked about Calloway Creek, about legacy, about what it meant to build something lasting for your community. He talked about the new development, Mercer Heights he was calling it, a 40-unit luxury residential community that would, he said, bring new life to the eastern corridor of the county. The room applauded. He talked about his family, his wife, Patricia, his children, the Mercer name and what it meant to carry it with integrity. The room applauded again. He looked confident. He looked like a man at the peak of his power. He had no idea. And I want to be honest with you. Sitting in that room, watching him speak, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Grief. Not for him. For the version of my childhood where he might have been someone different. For the uncle who might have looked at a 27-year-old girl and said, "I believe in you. Go find out what you're made of." He hadn't been that person. But for just a moment, I mourned that he hadn't. Then he said something that ended the morning. He said from the podium, loud enough for the whole room, "I want to raise a glass to everyone who has stood by this family, and a quiet acknowledgement for those who bet against us over the years." He smiled. They know who they are. He wasn't looking at me. He didn't have to. Everyone at that table had heard about the niece who left for the city and hadn't made anything of herself. They knew who the subtle dig was for. I felt the flush rise in my face, and then I felt something else rise behind it. Absolute calm. I waited until he left the stage, until the cocktail hour resumed and the room relaxed back into conversation and laughter. I found my Aunt Patricia first. "Diane, you're still here," she said, surprised. "I thought you might have slipped out already." "No," I said. "Actually, I was hoping Gerald could spare a few minutes. I have something I'd like to discuss with the family, privately." Patricia's eyes narrowed slightly. "What sort of something?" "A financial matter," I said. "Something that affects the new development." She excused herself, and I watched her move through the room to find Gerald. I watched him look over at me. His expression shifted from mild annoyance to cautious curiosity. They gathered in the small anteroom off the main hall. Gerald, Patricia, Regina, Derek. Family only. I walked in and closed the door. Gerald looked at me with the measured patience of a man who was certain this would take very little of his time. "Diane, what is this about?" I said, "I wanted to tell you something before the evening went any further. I felt like you deserved to hear it from me directly." "Hear what?" I reached into my clutch and pulled out the document, set it on the table between us. He looked down at it. It was a 2-page executive summary. On the header, in clean black font, was the name of the holding company I controlled. Below it, a brief description of the assets under management. And below that, in a simple table, the loan portfolio, including 4 specific accounts under Mercer Real Estate Holdings, LLC. Gerald picked it up. I watched his face. He read the first paragraph. His expression didn't change. He read the second. Still nothing. Then he reached the loan schedule. And I saw it. The exact moment understanding arrived. It was almost imperceptible. A slight stillness in the jaw. A small, careful blink. He looked up at me. "What is this?" His voice was very controlled. That's a summary of my firm's loan portfolio, I said. Specifically, the accounts we acquired when we purchased Creston Capital Partners 14 months ago. He stared at me. Patricia said from across the room, Gerald, what is it? He didn't answer her. Regina stepped forward and looked at the document over his shoulder. I watched her read. I watched her face go through the same sequence: confusion, recognition, disbelief. Diane, Gerald said slowly, are you saying that you hold the notes on our properties? Yes, I said. All 4 commercial accounts. $2.3 million outstanding, including the restructured balance from 18 months ago. Silence. Deep, complete silence. Derek said, That's not possible. I understand why it's surprising, I said, but it's documented. Our legal team has been managing the account for over a year. You've been making payments to us without knowing it. Patricia made a sound, not a word, just a sound, like the air going out of something. Gerald set the document down on the table very carefully. He was working to keep his face neutral. I could see the effort it was costing him. What do you want? He asked. And that was the question I had been sitting with for 8 years. What did I want? I had run through this moment in my mind so many times. In some versions, I was cold. In some versions, I was triumphant. In some versions, I wept. In some versions, I was my mother's daughter, and I forgave them everything and found some graceful way to use this moment for something other than power. What came out of my mouth was something in between all of those. I said, Gerald, do you remember what you told me at your celebration party, the year I was 27? He looked at me blankly. You told me that some people are built for big things, I said, and some people are built for simple, steady things, and you told me there was no shame in knowing which one I was. Something moved in his face, the memory arriving. You said it with love, I said. I know you believed that. He was silent. I just wanted you to know, I said quietly, which one I am. I did not destroy them. I want you to understand that. Because the story could have gone that way, and there is a part of me, the part that lay awake in that motel room, that had considered it. I had the power to call the loans, to trigger the acceleration clause, to place the properties into receivership. The legal mechanism was there. The documentation was clean. I did not do it. Instead, I proposed a restructuring. Revised terms, lower interest, extended timeline, modified covenants that would give the Mercer properties room to breathe, in exchange for a formal acknowledgement of the account transfer, transparency going forward, and one thing that wasn't in any legal document. I asked Gerald to look at me and say that he had been wrong about what I was capable of. That was it. No press release, no announcement, no performance in front of the gala guests in the next room. Just him and me and the truth of it. He stood across that small table from me for a very long moment. I watched him weigh the things that men like Gerald Mercer weigh. His pride, his position, the story he had told about himself for 60 years. And then something happened that I was not prepared for. His eyes went wet, not crying, not quite, but the kind of wet that comes from something breaking quietly behind the surface. He said, You built all of this on your own. Yes, I said. He said, And you came back looking like you hadn't. Yes. He was quiet. Then, why? I thought about how to answer that. I said, I needed to know if you were someone who only respected success after it had a logo on it, or someone who could recognize it in a cotton blouse. He absorbed that. A long pause, then so quietly that no one else in the room could hear it. I underestimated you. I was wrong to do that. I nodded. Patricia was crying, properly crying. I hadn't expected that either. Regina was standing very still, looking at the document on the table, and I couldn't read what was on her face. Not anger, not exactly shame. Something more complicated. The expression of a person who is rapidly reordering their understanding of the world. Derek hadn't said anything in several minutes. He was looking at his father. I picked up the document from the table. I'll have our legal team reach out Monday, I said. We'll set up a meeting to review the new terms. I turned to walk out. Diane. Gerald's voice stopped me. I turned. He said, Your mother would be proud. I stood there for a moment. The grief came back. The real grief, the one I'd been carrying for 16 years. Not for what he had been to me, for what she would never see. I said, I know. And I walked back out into the gala. The funny thing about power is how invisible it looks when you're carrying it correctly. I walked back into that room full of Calloway Creek's finest, and I got a glass of water from the bar, and I stood near the back, and I listened to the band play. Nobody in that room knew what had just happened in the anteroom. Nobody saw anything. A woman in a navy dress and scuffed shoes, standing quietly near the back of the room. The one who came back from the city without making it. The Mercer girl who never quite fit. I stood there and I felt, for the first time in a very long time, completely at peace. Not because I had won, not because I had proven something, but because I had finally stopped needing to. The drive back to Atlanta took 4 hours. I left Sunday morning, before the family woke up. I drove the dented Honda down the same road I had driven out of Calloway Creek 8 years ago. The sun was coming up over the Georgia fields, gold and quiet, turning everything soft. I thought about my uncle's face, the wet in his eyes. I thought about my cousin Regina's expression, that complicated rearranging of everything she had assumed. I thought about Patricia crying and not knowing quite why. I thought about Derek, who had looked at his father in a way that told me he was also perhaps seeing something new, something. Families are strange things. They are made of people who are capable of tremendous cruelty to each other and tremendous love at the same time, sometimes in the same moment. The cruelty doesn't cancel the love. The love doesn't excuse the cruelty. What I had done in that anteroom, I was not sure it was justice. I was not sure it was revenge. I was not sure it was forgiveness. It was something that didn't have a clean name. It was me, standing in my own truth. Finally, completely, without apology. 3 months after the gala, Gerald Mercer called me. Not to discuss loan terms, our legal teams had handled that. He called me directly, on my personal number, which I had given Patricia during the new account setup process. He called on a Tuesday evening. I almost didn't answer. I answered. He said, I've been thinking about something you said, that you needed to know if I could recognize success in a cotton blouse. A pause. I want you to know that I've been thinking about how many times in my life I didn't recognize it, not just with you. I said, Gerald. Let me finish, he said. I've spent my whole life believing that the shape of success was something I could see from the outside. Truck, title, table at the right restaurant. A pause. You walked back in here looking like you had nothing, and you had everything. I didn't say anything. He said, I'm sorry, Diane, for what I said at that party, and for the years of not seeing you properly. I sat with that for a long time. Then I said, thank you, Gerald. Not, it's okay. Not, I forgive you. Because it wasn't okay, and forgiveness is not a thing you perform in a sentence. Just, thank you. Which was true. Regina called 2 weeks after that. The conversation was shorter. She was not a person who came easily to vulnerability. She talked around the edges of it for a while, mentioned she'd been thinking, mentioned she'd been talking to a therapist, mentioned that she'd looked me up properly and read about some of the work my firm had done. Then she said, I think I've been really unkind to you. I said, yes, you have. She didn't flinch. I know. Silence. I don't know what to do with that, she said. I said, neither do I. Not yet. She said, okay, and then, can I call you again sometime? I said, yes. I want to tell you something about the version of this story that I used to imagine. When I was 27, driving out of Calloway Creek with $11,000 and a bruised heart, I used to imagine a version of this story where I came back and crushed them, where I stood in front of that whole town and made sure everyone knew what I had built and what they had said and how wrong they had been. I used to imagine their faces in that crowd, humiliated, reduced, finally understanding. And in the imagination, it felt like relief. What actually happened in that anteroom, the quiet room, the document on the table, the tears I hadn't expected, the words I hadn't planned, that felt like something the younger version of me couldn't have accessed. It felt like being so secure in what I had become that I no longer needed to burn anything down to prove it. The girl who drove away from Calloway Creek needed them to be destroyed to feel safe. The woman who drove back didn't need anything from them at all. And that was the real power. Not the loans, not the leverage, not the legal documents. The moment I walked back into that room and looked at the people who had diminished me, and I felt nothing but clarity. That was the thing no one could take away. I want to leave you with this. There is a particular kind of strength that the world doesn't talk about enough. It's not the strength of the grand gesture or the dramatic confrontation or the satisfying public humiliation of the people who hurt you. It's quieter than that. It's the strength of the person who kept going when no one was watching, who made the call when the loss was real, who studied at night after working all day, who drove 4 hours in a dented car because she needed to look the people who underestimated her in the eye, not to destroy them, but to finally, irrevocably, stop being afraid of them. That kind of strength doesn't arrive with a speech. It arrives in the moment you realize you no longer need one. If anyone in your life has told you what you're built for, if anyone has measured you quickly and handed you back a verdict before you'd had the chance to become the thing you were becoming, I want you to hear this. They were measuring the wrong thing. They were looking at where you were. They could not see where you were going. Only you can see that. And the only thing you owe anyone, your critics, your family, your doubters, the room full of people who watched you leave and assumed they knew the ending, the only thing you owe them is nothing. You owe yourself everything. Go build it. I drove home to Atlanta on a Sunday morning with the windows down and the Georgia fields rolling past, and I thought about what it means to come home. Not to a place, to yourself. I had left Calloway Creek at 27 with something to prove. I came back at 35 with nothing to prove. And that was the difference that changed everything. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. If this story moved you, if it made you feel seen, or inspired, or like you exhaled something you'd been holding, please leave a comment below. Tell me your story. Tell me what you're building. Tell me who doubted you. I read every single one. And if you're new here, welcome. There are more stories like this waiting for you, and I hope you'll stay. Take care of yourself. I'll see you in the next one.